Hi everyone, welcome to our channel. Douglas Macgregor expressed his desire for his State of the Union response to reach a wider audience in Europe, emphasizing the importance of making it available on their website. He highlighted disappointment in both President Biden's remarks and President Trump's response, criticizing Biden for downplaying serious issues while framing others as existential threats to America, such as Ukraine. In fact, he opened with a topic that holds little interest for most Americans, bluntly stating that they don't care much about it. Their attention is focused more on domestic matters, particularly the situation at the border and within the country. President Trump, on the other hand, highlighted his accomplishments during his time in office and projected a vision of improvement upon his return. However, he found little substance in either of their remarks, perceiving them as driven more by impulse than careful consideration. He, along with others involved, deliberated on what needed to be addressed in their response, emphasizing the importance of being truthful about the fragile state of the Union across various aspects, such as society, finances, economy, and military capabilities. They emphasized the need to move beyond incessant interventionism and only resort to military action when directly threatened or when defending allies. He stressed the dangers of allowing American national security to be dictated by the interests of other nations, citing concerns about being influenced by Israeli or European interests, particularly in Eastern Europe concerning Ukraine and Russia. He expressed a sentiment against being controlled by external forces and highlighted the necessity of regaining control over borders and enforcing the rule of law within the country. Moreover, he emphasized the importance of securing not just land borders, but also ports and airfields, highlighting the significant influx of illegal immigrants through ports like San Francisco and New York due to diversion of resources towards other global concerns such as operations in the South China Sea. The military is currently engaged in the Persian Gulf, diverting attention to issues beyond our concerns. While we provide security to other nations, our own remains inadequately protected. Our focus, as argued, should lie within the Western Hemisphere rather than spreading thinly across the Eurasian landmass. There's a pressing need to address national sovereign debt, a topic often avoided. History attests to the significance of debt spanning thousands of years. The proposed solution involves both cutting spending and restructuring debt to manageable levels. However, current budget projections show a significant deficit with a substantial portion being borrowed, exacerbating concerns about currency devaluation and inflation. Furthermore, there's frustration over the continuous assault on our culture and national identity. Attacking these elements undermines a country's ability to defend itself, rendering it vulnerable. Despite efforts to suppress the message, its reception in the United States indicates its impact. Addressing these issues is crucial to overcoming the detrimental effects of prevailing fictions both domestically and in Europe. Americans are increasingly questioning the concept of democracy, recognizing the corruption and subversion within our democratic processes. Concerns about electoral integrity and the prevalence of corruption within government and bureaucracy highlight the disconnect between the ideal of democracy and its reality in the United States. Additionally, there's skepticism about the promotion of democracy through military actions, with a history of resorting to force against dissenting nations, contradicting the principles of democracy. The notion of defending a liberal order through offensive military actions raises questions about the true motivations behind such interventions, especially when initiated against nations that have not attacked the United States. Preemptive military action, often justified under the guise of self-defense, is criticized as counterproductive and detrimental to international stability. The long-standing practice of preemptive war dating back to the Vietnam War era is questioned for its effectiveness in achieving desired outcomes and promoting American interests globally. Regarding American national power and influence, economic strength is identified as the primary source enabling prosperity at home and fostering alliances abroad. The historical debate between figures like Washington, Hamilton, and Jefferson underscores differing viewpoints on this matter. Perspectives on America's role in the world with an emphasis on economic prosperity rather than ideological exportation. Washington and Hamilton's argument for becoming a beacon of prosperity prevailed over Jefferson's advocacy for aligning with the French Revolution, highlighting divergent approaches to international engagement and the projection of American influence. The American Revolution, in hindsight, is likened more to conservative movements such as Cromwell's Puritan Revolution than the radical upheaval witnessed in France. Jefferson's presidency, contrary to his prior ideals, reflects a conservative approach to governance and international affairs. The foundation of American strength historically rested upon prosperity and the integrity of its government institutions. While acknowledging the presence of corruption within bureaucracies, the government remained relatively honest with a small bureaucracy and no overseas holdings. However, there were brief departures from this ethos, notably during Teddy Roosevelt's presidency, when there was a push towards imperial expansion, exemplified by the occupation of the Philippines. Subsequent administrations grappled with the consequences of colonial ambitions, with varying degrees of reluctance to engage in global interventionism. Eisenhower's approach to international alliances, particularly NATO, emphasized the need for these alliances to serve as temporary measures to restore stability and prosperity to war-torn nations, rather than perpetuate a state of perpetual conflict. The collapse of the Soviet Union presented an opportunity for the United States to promote prosperity beyond its borders, but this was often overshadowed by a pursuit of global military, political, and financial dominance. The focus on financial hegemony, especially evident in institutions like SWIFT, had strained relations with emerging powers like Russia, China, and India, leading to growing tensions and challenges to American influence. The ramifications of this pursuit of hegemony are becoming increasingly apparent as global dynamics shift, highlighting the need for a reassessment of American priorities towards fostering prosperity at home and maintaining peaceful relations abroad. It's evident that with a rapidly escalating national sovereign debt nearing $35 trillion, the ability to exert long-term hegemony becomes increasingly untenable. This sentiment has been echoed by figures like Putin, who question the rationale behind American involvement in distant conflicts such as Eastern Ukraine. When domestic issues remain pressing, the State of the Union response emphasizes a return to focusing on domestic affairs, prioritizing fiscal and national health over foreign entanglements. This includes revitalizing the energy sector by leveraging traditional sources like oil, gas, and coal, rather than overly relying on alternative energies. Furthermore, there's a call to reinvigorate high-end manufacturing, a sector where the United States has seen a decline due to policies that facilitated the outsourcing of production. However, there's a disconnect between the priorities of the ruling elite and the general population. The elite's mentality, rooted in the notion that another country's success somehow translates into America's failure, persists from the Cold War era. This mindset tends to shift blame for domestic issues onto external factors, reflecting a reluctance to address problems at home head-on. Unfortunately, there's a prevailing sentiment among many Americans who prefer to view the nation as a flawless society, despite acknowledging its imperfections. This reluctance to confront internal shortcomings is gradually diminishing as the reality becomes harder to ignore. Concerning relations with Russia and other BRICS nations, there's a recognition that their reactions are often a response to American policies and behavior. However, altering this dynamic requires a shift in American attitudes towards cooperation rather than confrontation, a notion that faces resistance in Washington. The prevailing mentality in the capital prioritizes dominance over cooperation, leading to a reluctance to relinquish leadership roles. The notion of American indispensability, epitomized by statements like Madeleine Albright's, has perpetuated a belief in the need for constant American involvement in global affairs. This stance has been reinforced by European allies who have become dependent on American leadership, reminiscent of the relationship between Greek city-states and the Roman Empire. Despite calls for European self-sufficiency as advocated by figures like Donald Trump, there's a reluctance among European states to invest in their own defense capabilities. This reliance on American military power complicates efforts to foster independent relationships with nations like Russia and China. Ultimately, the prospects for improved relations between Europe and Russia hinge on Europe's ability to emancipate itself from dependence on American military support and chart its own course in international affairs. However, achieving this goal requires a significant shift in mindset and policy direction, which remains uncertain at present. One final point to consider is the need for a shift in perspective. European nations often adopt a stance of moral superiority, positioning themselves as morally superior to nations like Russia. This perception is rooted in the belief that they uphold human rights and democratic principles. However, upon closer examination, we see instances of censorship and oppression in countries like Germany, France, and Great Britain, which contradict the idea of respect for human rights. True respect for human rights entails fostering a society where all viewpoints can be freely expressed without fear of reprisal or censorship. The notion that some views are inherently more morally justified than others must be abandoned, as it invariably leads to governmental tyranny. This attitude of moral supremacy contributes to global tensions, as it demands conformity to Western ideals and values. This approach alienates countries like China, which prioritize business partnerships over ideological influence. Furthermore, attempts to impose Western ideologies such as LGBTQ rights on other nations are often met with resistance and resentment. This insistence on conformity to Western norms reflects a minority government imposing its will on the majority, undermining the principles of democracy. In light of these challenges, both European nations and the United States must reassess their approach to international relations. They must refrain from imposing their values on others and instead engage in respectful dialogue and cooperation. This shift is particularly pertinent in the case of Russia, where demonizing leaders like Putin overlooks the flaws within Western governance and perpetuates a false sense of moral superiority. While the removal of Victoria Nuland is a crucial step towards disengaging from Ukraine, she represents the interventionist and warmongering faction in Washington that has fueled conflict in Ukraine. Nuland and her allies have been instrumental in establishing biolabs and CIA stations in Ukraine, which serve as platforms for anti-Russian activities. Removing her from her position symbolizes a shift in direction. From the outset, I maintain two key points. Firstly, Ukraine has no realistic chance of prevailing in this conflict with Russia. While it's taken Russia longer than expected, they pursued. Could there be a subtle shift in the balance of power in today's geopolitical landscape? In the grand theater of world politics, a strategy of incrementalism has slowly but surely been unspooling. This approach, designed to avoid provoking the West, has seen conflicts gradually cool down, followed by a quiet withdrawal and shift in focus. Take, for instance, the evolving scenario in Ukraine. A gradual disengagement from Ukraine is now being witnessed. The US military, in a definitive move, signals the end of its involvement. President Biden has made it abundantly clear that deployment of troops to Ukraine is off the table. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Europeans, particularly the globalist elites who opted to follow the US lead, now find themselves grappling with the consequences of their involvement. As the US pulls back, some European leaders are attempting to maintain an illusion of escalation. Yet beneath the surface, there's little substance to these threats. The reality of the situation paints a different picture. The Russians, though currently pausing, are doing so primarily due to logistical challenges. However, as conditions improve, they'll likely press further into the fray. The ultimate resolution of this conflict might not come from Washington, but rather from Europe. A neutral Ukraine could be achieved, but it will require Europeans to take the lead in negotiating an end to the conflict. This, however, is no small task. The trust between Russia and the West, particularly the US, is severely strained. The situation in Odessa exemplifies this precarious balance. Any attempt by NATO or Western forces to intervene militarily could result in significant casualties. The Russians have demonstrated their preparedness and have the logistical infrastructure to project military power effectively. In this context, it's crucial to acknowledge the limitations of Western military capabilities and the potential consequences of any military action in the region. Instead of flexing military muscle, efforts should focus on diplomatic solutions to de-escalate tensions and seek a peaceful resolution to the conflict. In summary, the geopolitical landscape is seeing a shift towards incrementalism as a strategy to avoid provoking the West. The US is disengaging from conflicts, such as in Ukraine, leaving Europe to grapple with the aftermath. Meanwhile, Russia waits in the wings, ready to advance as conditions improve. The resolution to these conflicts lies not in military might, but in diplomatic negotiations led by Europe. It's a delicate dance of power, where every move could tip the scales in a different direction. This is the nature of geopolitics today. It's a chessboard, and the kings and queens are making their moves. The question is, who will checkmate first?